The wagon stopped at the edge of Juniper Flats on the first day of December, 1876. And Willa Hartwell was the first one down. Not Brock, not Clem, who was 16 and tall enough to help with the stepping. Willa swung herself off the bench before the wheels had finished settling into the mud, landed with both boots in earth that grabbed and held. And she didn't look back at her family watching from the canvas opening. She walked. 20 paces north, eyes moving across the scrubland, reading the lay of the valley the way another woman might read a letter. Then she turned and walked 20 paces south. Then she stood still. The wind came in from the northwest, and it had teeth. Not the playful cold of October mornings back in Ohio, where you pulled your collar up and thought nothing more of it. This was a working cold, a cold with intention. It moved through her wool coat like the coat wasn't there, found the back of her neck, found the gap at her wrist between glove and sleeve, and stayed. Willa noted it, filed it, kept moving. The valley floor spread out before her in shades of brown and gray, and the dull silver of dormant sage. Juniper trees stood scattered across the lower ground, twisted and tough. The kind of trees that didn't grow so much as endure. To the northeast, maybe 3 miles distant, the land rose and darkened where pine met foothills. That was the timber. That was what they'd been told about in Redwater Gulch, when the land office clerk with the ink-stained fingers had called this parcel promising. Willa had watched the man's eyes when he said it, and she'd understood then what promising meant. It meant nobody else had wanted it. It meant the families who'd arrived in spring and summer had looked at this particular stretch of Colorado high plains and chosen somewhere else. The Hartwells had arrived in December. Behind her, she heard Brock climb down, heard the familiar rhythm of his boots, the slight drag of his left heel that had been with him since the mining accident in Pennsylvania 18 years ago. She heard Clem drop from the wagon gate, heard Ida's voice carrying the particular skepticism of 12 years old. This is it then, and heard no one answer her. Willa came back to the wagon. She looked at Brock. He was 42 years old, and the plains had already found every line on his face. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, reading the same valley she'd just read, and she could see the arithmetic running behind his eyes. Days until hard freeze. Cords of wood needed per week. Number of mouths. Number of nights between now and March. She'd been running the same arithmetic. "We'll need water first," she said. "I can hear the creek, but can't see it from here. Wind's shifting it. It's east of those junipers." He pointed. "Quarter mile, maybe less." "Good." She turned to the wagon. "Clem, you and Finn get the camp kit down. We're not moving again today." Clem was already moving before she finished speaking. He was 16 and built like his father, broad through the shoulder and long in the arm, with his mother's eyes the kind of gray-green that looked different in different light. He'd been quieter than usual for the last 3 days of travel, since they'd crossed into the territory proper, and the land had begun to flatten and empty out around them. Willa had watched him watching the horizon, and she'd recognized what she saw. He was deciding whether he believed in this. She'd let him decide. Finn came tumbling out of the wagon behind his brother, 9 years old. and already talking about the creek before his feet hit the ground. He had a way of moving through the world like he was cataloging it, picking things up, turning them over, setting them down in order. He'd spent the last hour of the journey organizing the tin cups by size. No one had asked him to. Ida climbed down next, deliberate and unimpressed, and stood with her arms crossed looking at the valley. She was 12, and she had a gift for accurate pessimism that Willa had long since stopped trying to discourage. Ida was almost always right. Better to know early. Bet came after 7 years old, and she didn't look at the valley at all. She looked at the sky. She'd been doing that since they'd left Ohio, studying the sky the way other children studied picture books, reading things in it that she'd sometimes report and sometimes keep to herself. She'd told Willa 4 days ago, out of nowhere, that the air smelled like the inside of a root cellar. Willa had paid attention. Last came little Cora, 3 years old, handed down from the wagon by Clem, with the solemn care he reserved for things that mattered most. Cora looked around at the new world with the open, unafraid curiosity of someone who didn't yet understand what fear was for. She picked up a rock immediately and examined it with great seriousness. Willa watched her youngest for a moment. Just a moment. Then she turned back to the work. They camped that first night beside the wagon fire, built small and tight against the wind the family arranged around it in the practiced geometry of people who'd learned to share warmth efficiently. Brock fed the fire with sage and juniper dry enough from the shrubs they'd gathered in the last hour of light. The wood caught clean and burned hot, but fast the way sage always did, a generous fire that didn't last. Finn had already begun sorting the fuel by size without being asked. They ate cold biscuits and salt pork, and the last of the cornmeal porridge that Willa had made that morning over a roadside fire, and carried in the iron pot insulated with burlap. It was still barely warm. Good enough. "How long to build the cabin?" Clem asked. 2 weeks if we push, Brock said. "We push," Willa said. Ida looked up from her tin cup. "The Dunbar family got here in June. They've already got a cabin and a woodshed and a root cellar. And Earl Dunbar's been to the mill twice." "Good for the Dunbars," Willa said. "I'm just saying, they had time to do it right. We'll do it right too. Just faster." Willa set down her own cup. "Different isn't wrong, Ida. Different is what you have." Ida looked unconvinced but went back to her food. That night, with Clem and Finn sharing the wagon bed, and the girls tucked in tight between Willa and Brock in the main compartment, Willa lay awake and listened to the high plains wind work the canvas. She listened to the way it found the wagon's edges. She listened to the breathing of her children, each one distinct. Finn's slight whistle, Ida's deep and even rhythm, Bet's barely there exhalations, Cora's small warm presence pressed against her side. She ran the numbers again in the dark. December 1st. Real cold, probably 3 weeks out. Possibly less at this elevation. The land office map showed the timber stand at 3 miles northeast, which she'd confirmed with her own eyes. She'd been told there was good pine there, seasoned wood ready for cutting. That had been the whole calculation, enough dry timber within hauling distance to build and to burn. She needed to see it herself. In the morning, she would see it herself. They broke ground on the cabin site on December 2nd, working from first light until they couldn't see. Willa had chosen the location the previous afternoon while Brock and Clem were scouting water a slight rise on the valley floor, protected on the north and west by a natural windbreak of old juniper and limestone outcropping. Not perfect. Good enough. The wind would hit the rock before it hit the walls. Brock was a capable builder. She knew this. He'd built their house in Ohio from raw lumber with his brother's help. And he'd done it well, built it to last. But Ohio timber was different. Ohio winters were different. And they had 13 days, not 6 months. She laid out the dimensions herself. 18 feet by 20. Not large. Large enough for a family of 7 to survive a winter without going mad, which was a different calculation than large enough for a family of 7 to be comfortable. The sleeping loft would go above low-ceilinged but functional. The stove in the northwest corner where Brock had confirmed the chimney draw would work best against the prevailing wind. Every decision made for warmth. First, everything else second. She was driving the second corner stake when she heard Brock's horse coming back from the northeast. She looked up. She could read Brock from 100 yards, not from his face he kept. His face Easy always had, but from his shoulders. When he carried bad news, something happened in the set of his shoulders that he never entirely managed to control. They came down and forward just slightly, as though he were leaning into it before he arrived. His shoulders were down. She set the maul against the stake and waited. He dismounted and led his horse the last 50 yards instead of riding, coming to her at walking pace, giving her time to prepare, which she noted and appreciated. The timber, she said. It wasn't a question. The good stuff is claimed. He stopped in front of her. Everything dry and ready, there's already a mark on it. The families who came in summer, they got to it first. He paused. What's left unclaimed is wet. October rains soaked the slash piles before the first freeze hit. Everything standing good is taken. Willa said nothing for a moment. She looked at the stakes she'd been driving, then at the stakes she'd already set. The rectangle of their future cabin marked out in the frozen mud. How wet. Heavy. Most of it you couldn't burn clean. You'd get smoke and smolder and not much heat. He took his hat off and turned it in his hands. We could try to dry it in the cabin once it's up, but it takes weeks to season properly, and we'd be burning green wood all that time. What about buying from the mill? I asked on the way back. Thatcher at the far end of the valley, he's got dry wood stacked. A full woodshed came in August. He's not selling. Brock put his hat back on. The mill in Redwater wants 3 times spring prices. I did the arithmetic. We'd be broke before February, and we need that money for seed. Willa picked up the maul. She drove the stake 3 more inches into the ground with 3 measured strikes. 1, 2, 3. And then she straightened up and looked at her husband. Who's Thatcher? Calvin Steer. Goes by Steer. Not Thatcher. I got his name wrong when I first asked around. Calvin Steer. Came in August with 2 wagons and 4 hired men already had the land surveyed before he arrived. He's got the best claim on the east side, good water, the largest share of the timber access. Brock paused. He was watching when I was looking at the wood. Didn't offer to help. Didn't threaten either. Just watch. Willa filed this. What does he want? I don't know yet. Nobody does something for nothing out here, she said. He'll show his hand eventually. Until then, we build. She handed Brock the other maul. They built. The 13 days that followed were the hardest of Willa's life, and she had lived through some hard days. She had buried her first child, a boy, born too early in the spring of 1868. She had nursed Brock through 2 years of lung trouble after he left the mines sitting beside him, through nights when she wasn't sure he'd be breathing by morning. She had packed and sold and left the only home she'd known as an adult and pointed her family west toward a parcel of land she'd never seen, betting everything on a promise in a newspaper advertisement. She understood hard, but this was a different kind of hard. This was the hard of the body's absolute limits pressed against an absolute deadline with no margin for error and no second chances. Dawn to dusk every day, Willa worked the cabin site during daylight and managed the household in the dark hours on either end. Brock and Clem felled timber the scattered juniper on the valley floor, tough and slow-burning but available and mostly dry, while she and Ida began clearing the foundation. The ground was not yet fully frozen at depth, but the surface was treacherous, iron-hard in the mornings, and boot-sucking by midday when the pale winter sun had worked on it for a few hours. Finn proved himself immediately. He was 9 years old and small for it. But he had something better than size. He had the ability to figure out the most efficient path between any 2 points, and he never stopped moving. He organized the tool rotation so the axes were always sharp and available. He managed the distances between work sites so no one walked farther than necessary. On the second day, without anyone asking him, he built a simple wheeled cart from scrap wood to haul clay from the creek bank, so Willa and Ida could chink the cabin logs more efficiently. It worked. She told him so. Bet's job was Cora, and she took it with a seriousness that was almost startling in a 7-year-old. She kept her little sister warm, kept her fed, kept her away from the work areas where heavy things moved. She also kept watching the sky. On the 6th day, she came to Willa at midday and said quietly that the clouds over the North Ridge were sitting wrong. Wrong how? Willa asked. Bet considered the question. Like something is sitting on them, she said, pushing them down. It snowed that night. Not much, 2 inches, but it was the first real snow of the season, and it came with a cold that was different in kind from what had come before. Willa lay awake listening to it and moved her timeline up by 2 days. Brock's hands bled through his gloves by the end of the first week. He wrapped them and kept working. He didn't mention them, and neither did Willa, because there was nothing to say. By the end of the 2nd week, Clem walked like an old man every morning for the first hour, his back locked from the day before, and he never once complained. He just walked slower until he was loose, and then he worked. Ida surprised everyone. She had resisted the assignment of splitting kindling on day one. "I know how to do more than that," she'd said flatly, and Willa had moved her to the chinking crew within the hour, where Ida's precise, methodical nature turned out to be exactly what was needed. She chinked logs with the focus of someone solving a mathematical problem, finding every gap and filling it completely before moving to the next. The north wall of that cabin would hold heat better than any other wall because Ida had worked it. On the 13th day, they set the stove. Brock had been saving this moment, Willa knew. He'd gotten the stove second-hand in Redwater Gulch, a good cast-iron range, heavy and solid, and he'd wrapped it in oilcloth for the journey and refused to let anyone use it as a seat during rest breaks. He and Clem wrestled it into the northwest corner of the cabin in the late afternoon of day 13, connected the flue pipe through the roof, and sealed the chimney collar with clay, while Willa watched. When it was done, Brock looked at her. "Want to try it?" he asked. "In the morning," she said. "Tonight we sleep inside." That night, the whole family lay on the cabin floor in their bedrolls. The loft not yet completed enough for the children, and Willa listened to the difference between being inside walls and being inside a wagon. It was the difference between enduring and surviving. She lay on her back in the dark and felt something in her chest ease just slightly for the first time in 2 weeks. Then she heard Cora cough. Small. Shallow. Once. Willa lay still and listened. Cora coughed again, a soft, wet sound in the darkness, and then sighed and was quiet. Willa did not sleep. In the morning, Brock lit the stove. He was careful with the first fire, feeding it dry sage and the driest of their juniper sticks, nursing it up slowly, the way you would with any new thing whose character you didn't yet know. The stove responded well. The flue drew clean, the smoke went up and out, and within 20 minutes the single room had begun to lose the hard cold that had settled into it overnight. Clem brought in wood from the pile they'd stacked outside, mostly juniper, with some of the pine they'd hauled from the accessible edge of the timber stand, the least wet of what was left unclaimed. He stacked it near the stove. Brock tried a piece of the pine. It hissed. It steamed. It smoldered and produced a thick yellowish smoke that did not go up the flue so much as it found the room, found the low places, found the eyes and the lungs. Brock pulled it out fast and threw it outside and opened the door to clear the air. Ida, from the corner where she was helping Bet spread bedrolls, said without looking up, "I knew it." "You knew it," Willa agreed. Brock stood in the doorway with cold air coming in around him, his face doing the thing it did when he was working through a problem he didn't yet have an answer to. "We can burn juniper and sage during the days," he said. "But for the cold nights, the real cold nights, we need something that burns longer and hotter. We need dry pine." "We know what we need," Willa said. "The question is how to get it." She was standing at the window, the single small window they'd cut in the east wall, looking out at the valley. The morning was iron-gray clouds, low and heavy. "We can't buy it. We can't cut and dry it fast enough in the usual way." She paused. "What dries wood?" "Time," Brock said. "Or a kiln. Or—" "Heat," Willa said. moving air and gentle heat sustained over days. We don't have a kiln. No. She turned from the window. But where do you get sustained warmth at a constant temperature no matter what the weather is doing outside? Brock went still. She watched him go still and watched his mind go somewhere back to somewhere. And she knew before he spoke what he was going to say. Underground, he said. He said it slowly like a man picking up something he'd set down a long time ago and checking to see if it still held together. He'd worked a coal operation in Pennsylvania for 2 winters, 1858 and 1859. Before the lung trouble, before Willa, before any of it. He didn't talk about those years much. Not because they were bad exactly, but because they belonged to a version of himself he'd moved away from, and he'd never seen a reason to go back. But he remembered things. He remembered how the mine shafts held their temperature year-round cool in summer, warmer than the surface in winter. How the miners had learned to read that stable deep earth warmth for their own purposes. How things stored underground kept without freezing and without spoiling. And he remembered something else. In one of the Pennsylvania mines where he'd worked briefly the operation, foreman had built a slow, dry room for the timber supports. Before installation, an underground chamber, where wet green wood was placed on slatted floors above a channel of waste heat from the surface equipment. The wood came out in 10 days, seasoned enough to trust with men's lives underground. Brock told Willa all of this standing in their half-warm cabin on the morning of December 14th. He told her, slowly pulling it back from memory as he went checking each piece before he set it down. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "How deep?" 6 feet for temperature stability. Maybe 7 to be safe. How big? Big enough to stack a winter's worth of wood with air moving through it. 12 by 8 maybe. 12 by 10 if we can manage it. And the heat channel. How does it work? He explained it. She asked 3 questions. He answered 2 and said he wasn't sure about the 3rd. And she nodded and said they'd figure it out when they got there. The ground's still workable close to the cabin, she said. The cabin mass has kept the soil near the south wall a little warmer. I checked it this morning. She looked at him. Another week and it'll be frozen too deep to work without heavy equipment we don't have. I know. Then we start today. He nodded. She turned to the room. Clem, she said. Ida, come here. She laid it out for them. At the table, the rough family that was their kitchen table. 2 planks on sawhorses with a piece of charcoal, and the back of an old flour sack. She drew the cabin. She drew the south wall. She drew the rectangle of the proposed underground room and the channel that would connect it to the stove's waste heat. Clem leaned over the drawing with his hands flat on the table, studying it the way he studied everything his mother brought him, seriously looking for the places where it could go wrong so they could address them before they did. Finn was there too, and he immediately began asking questions about the slatted floor and the air circulation, which was exactly the right question, and Willa told him so. Bet stood at the edge of the group, not looking at the drawing but at the space behind the stove. Her head tilted slightly, thinking. Ida said it could cave in. It won't if we timber it right, Willa said. We're not minors. Your father was. She looked at Brock. Close enough. Ida looked at the drawing for a long moment. What if it doesn't work? What if we dig this room and the wood still won't dry? Then we've lost a week's work, and we'll figure something else, Willa said. But it'll work. The physics of it is sound. She straightened up. I need you to trust the physics, Ida. Can you do that? Ida looked at the drawing one more time. Show me the math, she said. So Willa showed her the math. Ground temperature at depth. Thermal transfer rates from the stove's chimney pipe estimated moisture reduction over 7 to 10 days in a 40-degree environment with moving air. It took 20 minutes. At the end of it, Ida said, "All right." Willa picked up the charcoal again and wrote the dimensions on the flour sack. We start with the corners, she said. The ground fought them. The first 6 inches were frozen solid, and Brock's pickaxe rang off it like a bell, the impact traveling up his arms and into his shoulders with a vibration that left his hands numb. He and Clem traded off every 30 minutes. 30 minutes of breaking frozen crust. 30 minutes of hauling and recovering while Willa supervised the perimeter, and Ida directed the spoil pile placement. The clay was going where the kitchen garden would eventually be. Willa had already planned where the kitchen garden would be. Even in December, even digging a hole in frozen earth to try to survive the winter part of her was already in spring. Finn, meanwhile, had found something useful to do with the rocks they were pulling from the subsoil. He was sorting them by size and stacking them against the north side of the cabin, where Willa had already told him she wanted a windbreak wall eventually. He didn't need to be told twice about anything. By the end of the first day, they had a pit 2 feet deep in the corners and 18 inches in the center. The frozen crust broken through into workable earth below. By the end of the second day, 4 feet. The third day, they broke through a clay layer into a band of sandy gravel that moved faster. And by evening, they had a pit 6 feet deep, 12 feet by 8 feet, with walls that showed the strata of the valley like a cross-section of geological time. Topsoil clay sand, more clay mixed with gravel, and at the very bottom a shelf of pale limestone bedrock that Brock tapped with his knuckle and said was exactly what he'd hoped for. Good floor, he said. Solid. Won't shift. Willa looked down at it from the surface. The pit was in shadow, the late afternoon light barely reaching the bottom. It smelled of cold earth and something mineral and old. She thought about all that earth above and the stable temperature it held. She thought about her wood and the fire she needed and the winter ahead. Good, she said. Now we build it up. The timbering took 4 more days. Brock was in his element here, and Willa stepped back and let him be. She watched him work with Clem, watched him explain how to position the corner posts and check them for plumb with a string and a stone, how to drive the horizontal runners and lock the cross bracing, so the earth's lateral pressure was carried through the structure rather than against it. He spoke while he worked patient and precise teaching as he built. And Clem listened the way Clem always listened, completely quietly filing everything. Willa watched her husband in those days with a feeling she sometimes had difficulty naming. It was not simply love, though it was that too. It was something more specific. It was the feeling of watching someone do what they were genuinely made to do, something that fit them the way a good tool fits a good hand, and knowing that this competence was one of the reasons you had chosen this person, and that you had chosen correctly. She let him have it. She managed everything else. The walls of the underground room were lined with planks. They'd milled from some of the less wet pine, not structural, just facing, creating a smooth interior surface that wouldn't catch splinters or snag clothing when someone moved through in lamplight. Ida insisted on getting it right, running her hands along each board after it was nailed, and calling out any gap that needed fixing. The floor came last. Willa had been thinking about it since Brock first described the Pennsylvania drawing room, and she had a specific idea that she'd been refining. She built the floor on short posts rising from the bedrock's 6-inch legs, evenly spaced with 1-inch slats running perpendicular, gapped 2 inches apart. The air would sink cold, hit the bedrock, and rise back up through the gaps in the floor, through the wood stacked above, and out through the vent stack at the far end of the room. Cold air in below, warm and damp air out above. Continuous convection, gentle and sustained. She explained this to Finn while they positioned the slats, and Finn didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "So the wood is breathing?" "Yes," Willa said. "Exactly that." Finn nodded and went back to work with the expression of someone who has been given a piece of information that organizes several other things that were already there. The heat channel was the most precise part of the whole system, and Willa took it herself. She cut through the cabin's south foundation log with a handsaw slowly and carefully, creating an opening 3 inches wide and 8 inches tall, not much bigger than her fist. She fitted a metal sleeve into the gap, a piece salvaged from an old flue pipe that Brock had found in a pile of discarded hardware at the Redwater Gulch General Store. It ran at a downward angle through the foundation into the underground room and terminated near the floor level. The idea was simple. Behind the stove, where the chimney pipe ran hot, there was waste heat that currently just went up and out. Brock would build a small baffle, a tin plate with a controlled opening that could divert a portion of that waste heat down through the channel into the underground room. Not much. Not enough to heat the cabin less. Just the excess, the heat that would otherwise be lost. The vent stack at the far end of the room was a piece of salvaged pipe running from the room's ceiling through 6 feet of earth and emerging 2 feet above ground level, capped against weather with a cone of tin that Finn had shaped on the second day. The cap had small gaps at the bottom edge for air escape and was angled against the prevailing wind. It took Brock 2 days to fabricate the baffle system. He worked at the forge he'd set up outside, a simple thing, a clay-lined pit with bellows shaping and reshaping the tin until the fit was right. He tested it with cold water first, checking the seal, checking the angles, checking that the flow could be controlled by turning the baffle plate. On the evening of December 19th, he fitted the last piece into place and told Willa it was ready. She said, "Tomorrow morning, full light." That night she lay awake again, and this time she was not afraid. December 20th arrived clear and cold, the sky above Juniper Flats, a deep and cloudless blue that Willa had come to recognize as the Colorado winter sky's way of apologizing for what it was about to do. Clear sky in winter out here meant the cold fell straight down, with nothing to slow it. The thermometer Finn had hung outside the cabin door read 14 degrees at dawn. The family gathered by the stove after breakfast. Even Cora was there, held on Clem's hip, pointing at the stovepipe with the authority of someone who had strong opinions about it. Willa built the fire herself. She used good juniper and the driest of the sage, built it methodically, let it establish before she added the larger pieces. When she had a solid bed of coals and the firebox was running clean and hot, she nodded to Brock. He opened the baffle halfway. They listened. For a moment, nothing. Then a sound like a long, slow exhalation, something settling into place air, beginning to move where it hadn't moved before. "Come," Willa said. They went outside, all of them, even Cora, and walked around to the south side of the cabin, where the vent stack emerged from the frozen ground. It was a simple iron pipe with a tin cap, nothing to look at. But Bet got there first because Bet always got to things first when there was something invisible to be noticed. And she held her palm flat over the vent opening and went perfectly still. Everyone waited. "It's warm," Bet said. Not loud, not excited even. Just a clear, precise report of observed fact, the way she reported everything. Willa came forward and held her own hand over the vent. The warmth came up slow and steady. Not hot, not impressive, but real, sustained. Underground air, moving, carrying moisture and cold out of the chamber, and drawing in the gentle heat that was feeding down through the channel from behind the stove. She held her hand there for a long moment. Then she looked at Brock. He was watching her, not the vent, and his face had done the opposite of what it did when he carried bad news. Something had come up in it. Some warmth of its own, quiet and earned. She gave him one nod. Then she said, "All right, we feel it." She turned back toward the cabin, and as she turned, she heard it from inside the cabin from the loft. Where Cora had been placed while they were outside, the sound drifted down through the walls and the cold air and found her. A cough, small and soft. Her youngest daughter, 3 years old, coughing in the loft of a half-finished cabin in the middle of a Colorado winter. Willa did not stop walking. She did not change her expression or her pace. But inside, in the part of herself that kept the real count, the count of what mattered most, she noted it, filed it, added it to the arithmetic, and began moving faster. The underground room stabilized at 55 degrees within 2 days. Willa checked it herself each morning, descending the ladder with a lamp and a thermometer, crouching in the narrow space between the timber walls and pressing the glass tube against the air where it moved slowest near the floor. 53. 54. On the morning of December 22nd, 55 degrees, and holding while the world above was 8 degrees and falling. She came up the ladder, set the thermometer on the shelf by the door, and went to the stove to check the baffle setting. Brock had built the baffle with 3 positions closed half full, and she'd been running it at half. The cabin was warm enough. The room below was warm enough. She left it where it was. This was how it began. This was the rhythm. Every morning before anyone else was fully awake, Willa was already in motion. She fed the stove first with the careful precision of someone who understood that heat was currency, and you did not spend currency carelessly. She used the juniper and sage for the morning fire. Quick heat, hot and clean enough to warm the cabin through breakfast and into the mid-morning. She saved the drying pine for nights when the cold outside pressed hardest against the walls, and they needed something that would burn slow and long and give back heat steadily for 3 or 4 hours without tending. Then she went down into the underground room. She had established the rule from the first day of operation, and she had stated it once and not repeated it because she didn't repeat rules. Only she decided what came out of the room, how much and when. Not because she didn't trust her family, because she understood in a way that was difficult to fully explain, but easy to feel that this supply of drying wood was not just a convenience. It was a margin. The margin between their family making it through winter and not making it through winter. Margins were not managed by committee. Margins were managed by the person who understood them most precisely. She brought up enough wood for 12 hours morning and evening, measured against her running calculation of burn rate, cabin heat retention, and overnight low temperature, as estimated by Beta. The system worked because every part of it worked together, and every part worked because Willa had thought through the connections. Finn ran the room itself. He had taken ownership of it with the focused intensity he brought to anything that had an internal logic he could master. And within 3 days he had built a system of organization that Willa could only have designed herself. He used charcoal marks on the timber walls to track each week's cutting week, 1 week, 2 week, 3, and established a strict rotation. New wood went to the back. Driest wood came from the front. He built the paths between the stacks to exact widths wide enough for a person with a lantern and an armful of wood no wider. He knew the room in the dark. He could navigate it by memory by the sound of his own footsteps changing as he passed from one section to another. Bet's role evolved without anyone planning it. She had discovered on the first morning that the vent stack's outflow had a temperature, and that the temperature told things. Strong, steady warmth rising meant the system was working, the stove was hot. The baffle was set right. Air was moving through the drying chamber as intended. Weak flow or an uneven pulse meant something needed attention. She checked it every 2 hours and reported to Willa, brief and precise. On the 4th day, Willa told her formally that this was her job. Bet accepted this the way she accepted most things, without particular expression, as though it were simply the correct arrangement of the world. Clem split wood most mornings out at the stump 40 feet from the cabin, working through the rounds he hauled in from the pine stand. He had developed the same eye for grain that good woodsmen develop the ability to read around and place the maul where the wood wanted to split, not where you wanted it to. He wasted almost nothing. The thinner pieces dried fastest, and so he specialized in them, maximizing surface area covering the fresh splits. With the old juniper bark he'd learned kept the snow off without sealing the moisture in. Ida checked every split. Nobody had asked her to, but the habit had developed naturally from her character, and Willa had ratified it immediately. Ida's eye was good and her standards were uncompromising, and she was 12 years old, and at least 3 of the men who would later ask for help would in the coming weeks find themselves receiving guidance from a 12-year-old girl on the proper splitting of firewood, which they would not enjoy and which they needed. And Willa watched everything. She moved through the system every day, checking the room, checking the baffle, checking the wood pile outside, and the rate at which it was being filled and depleted, checking the cabin walls for new gaps in the chinking that the cold had opened, checking Cora. Always Cora. The small cough that had started on the night of December 20th was still small, still shallow. It came and went worse in the mornings when the cabin had cooled overnight better by midday, when the stove had warmed the air. Willa had seen worse in all her children at one time or another, and knew the difference between a chest cold settling in and something more dangerous. This was settling. She fed Cora extra broth, kept her away from drafts, made sure she was never the coldest person in the room. But she noted it. Every morning, every night. She kept a separate count in the back of her mind. A count she didn't write down. Because some numbers you didn't write down. On December 23rd, the first neighbors came. The Dunbar family from the north end of the valley, Earl and his wife, Margaret, their 2 adult sons, and the sons' wives, good people established. They'd arrived in June and built well. It was the steam that brought them. The vent stack on cold mornings produced a visible plume that rose straight up in still air or bent dramatically in wind, and it looked from a distance like a small factory or a hot spring or something that demanded explanation. Earl Dunbar was a tall man, not yet 60, but moving that way with a face that had been in the weather for decades and hair the color of old pine bark. He carried himself the way some men did, who had been the most capable person in most rooms they'd entered. Not arrogantly, but with a settled assurance that could read as skepticism. He looked at the vent stack and then at Willa, who had come out to meet them. "What are you burning?" he asked. "Juniper and pine," she said. "Same as everyone." "Then what's that?" He nodded at the steam. She showed them. All of them, Earl, Margaret, the sons and their wives, standing in the cold with their collars up. She opened the hatch, let them look down into the room, held her lamp so they could see the wood stacks and the slatted floor and the heat channel opening at the near end. Earl crouched at the hatch and looked for a long time without speaking. Then he straightened. "How long until the wood is dry enough to burn clean?" "7 days for the thinner splits, 12 for the rounds." He looked at his wife. She looked at the hatch. "Can we use it?" she asked. "Bring our wet wood." "I'll think about it," Willa said. Which meant yes, but on terms she hadn't finished deciding yet. She thought about it for 1 day and decided yes in limited quantity, and they would learn the system in exchange. She would give them 20 splits from the front stack, dry and ready, and they would bring 20 splits of their own wet wood to go in the back. Knowledge shared system demonstrated mutual benefit, not charity. Exchange. The Dunbars were satisfied with this. They came 3 more times in the following week, each time bringing their wet wood and learning a little more of the system, and each time leaving with dry wood and a clearer picture of how it worked. The Coopers followed. Then the Yates family from the creek bottom. Then a family named Hollander, who'd arrived only 2 weeks before the Hartwells, and who had, as near as Willa could tell, no real plan for winter at all. They'd arrived with good intentions and insufficient arithmetic. She helped them, too, on the same terms, exchange of knowledge for exchange of wood. By the week before Christmas, 6 families had visited. Willa kept count of everything. What came in and what went out. The rate at which the drying room was filling with wet wood from other families, and the rate at which dry wood was emerging from the front. The balance was tight, but positive. She ran the numbers each evening and found that they were still accumulating more than they were spending, slowly building the margin she needed. She noticed Calvin Steer on his second visit. He had come the first time with the Yates family, stood at the back of the group, said nothing, and left when they left. She'd noted his presence, but not his behavior. There had been too much else to manage. On the second visit, he came alone. She was splitting firewood with Ida when she looked up, and he was standing at the edge of the yard watching. He was perhaps 50, spare and angular, with close-cut gray hair, and the look of a man who wasted nothing, not money, not words, not observation. He watched the way certain men watch things, with a quality of attention that suggested the watching was itself an activity, not a byproduct of something else. He was not observing the vent stack or the hatch. He was watching Willa. She held his gaze for a moment and then went back to her work. That evening, when the children were in the loft and the cabin had gone quiet, she told Brock, "Steer came again today." Brock looked up from the harness he was mending. What did he want? Nothing. She paused. "That's what I'm telling you. He didn't ask for anything, didn't offer anything, just watched." Brock set down the harness. "What do you think he wants?" She had been thinking about this since Steer had stood at the edge of her yard and watched her. She'd been running it the way she ran everything, methodically from first principles, asking what was visible and what it implied. "He has his own wood," she said. "Came in August, has a full shed, no shortage. He doesn't need what I'm selling. He doesn't need the knowledge either. He's smart enough to figure the system out himself if he wanted to." She picked up the darning she'd set aside. "He's watching to see what I'm building, not the room, the network." She worked the needle through the wool. "He sees families coming and going. He sees who's dependent on what. He's figuring out the map of who owes what to whom." Brock was quiet for a moment. "And what does he do with that map?" "I don't know yet." She tied off the thread. "But nobody studies a map unless they want to go somewhere." The first theft happened on the morning of December 27th. Finn went down the ladder at his usual time just before breakfast, lamp in hand, moving through the familiar dark of the underground room by memory and habit. He was gone 4 minutes. When he came up, Willa was at the stove. She looked at his face and set down the ladle. She went down herself without a word. She stood in the room with her lamp raised, and she looked at what was there and what was not there. The hatch lock, a wooden pin system that Brock had built into the frame, had been worked open from outside. The marks were clear. Something thin had been inserted to lift the pin, and the wood around the lock socket showed fresh gouges. The hatch had been opened from above. From the front, 2 sections of the room, the driest wood, Everything she'd been managing toward the wood that had been in the room the longest, the wood that was within days of being ready to burn clean and hot through a January night, was gone. Not all of it. They had taken what they could carry in one trip. Probably 2 people, probably 2 loads. They had been somewhat careful. The back sections were undisturbed. The system's organization mostly intact. But they had knocked over one stack in the front section and left it without restacking it. Willa stood in the room and looked at the fallen stack and the empty space where the front supply had been. She was very still. She breathed slowly the way she did when she needed to make a calculation and could not afford to let anything interfere with it. She counted what remained. She counted the rate at which the back sections would be ready. She counted the days between now and the point at which the theft would begin to put real pressure on the family's margin. The number she arrived at was not catastrophic. Not yet. They had lost 7 or 8 days' worth of their best supply, the difference between confidence and tightness, not the difference between surviving and not. If nothing else went wrong. She straightened the fallen stack before she left. When she came up the ladder, the whole family was at the table. Brock had heard her come up and had stopped pretending to be asleep. Clem was watching the ladder opening. Ida had her arms crossed. Finn stood by the window with the careful stillness of someone who has delivered bad news and is waiting to find out how bad it was. Willa set her lamp on the shelf and turned around. "We lost 7 or 8 days of the front stock," she said. "The lock was forced. 2 people, I think, came sometime overnight. The back sections are intact." Brock said, "I'll go look at the tracks. The ground's frozen. You won't get much." She went to the stove and moved the kettle onto the hot plate. "We tighten from here. No more distributions until we've rebuilt the front section." "We tell the families who've been coming?" Clem asked. "Not yet." "We should make a better lock," Brock said. He was already up, moving toward the door. Willa said his name, just his name, flat and even. And he stopped. "A lock won't solve this," she said. "A lock just makes the next person more careful when they come." She poured hot water over the grounds in the pot. "The problem isn't the lock. The problem is that someone out there is cold enough and scared enough to do this. Until we understand who and why, we can't fix it." Brock stood in the doorway. "You want to wait. I want to think," she said. "Which is different." He nodded and sat back down. Ida said from the table, "It was steer." Everyone looked at her. "I don't know that it was steer," Ida said. "But if I were steer, it would have been me." Willa looked at her daughter for a moment. 12 years old. This particular kind of mind, the kind that didn't assume the worst, but would map the worst as a possibility. And mark it clearly was something she had tried to nurture carefully in Ida. Not cynicism, precision. "Keep that thought," Willa said. "Don't say it again until we know more." Brock built a new lock. Iron this time, a simple bolt mechanism that he spent the better part of a day at the outdoor forge, and it was solid and clean and would hold against casual force. Willa didn't argue. A better lock wasn't the solution, but it was a reasonable precaution, and she was not opposed to reasonable precautions. She also began varying when she opened the hatch. Not the same time every morning, not the same time every evening. If someone was watching the rhythm of access, she wanted to make the rhythm harder to read. Christmas came and went quietly. Willa made cornbread and dried apple pie with the last of the sugar. Brock had found at the Redwater Gulch store on his last supply run a small wooden horse he'd carved himself during the last week he'd been doing it at night, after the children were asleep. And Willa hadn't asked about the wood shavings she'd found by the stove, because she'd understood. Cora received the horse with the total joy of someone for whom a wooden horse and a real horse are of approximately equal value. She carried it everywhere for the rest of the day. Willa watched her daughter with the horse and felt briefly the thing that the work and the arithmetic and the tightness of the margins didn't usually leave room for. She let herself feel it for one full minute, and then she put it away and went back to the count. Cora's cough was the same, no worse. She was eating well and her color was good. Willa kept the night fires careful. On December 28th, the Hollander family arrived with their adult son and asked for more wood than Willa's terms allowed. She explained the terms again. On December 29th, a man she didn't recognize came from the direction of Redwater Gulch and said his name was Pickett and his wife was pregnant and they'd been sleeping in their wagon for 2 weeks. She gave him what she could, which was less than he needed, and told him the terms of the exchange system. He came back the next day with his wet wood. She gave him the address of the Coopers who were building a second access point on their own property along the lines of what Willa had described. He understood. He joined the network. On December 30th, Calvin Steer came to the meeting at Earl Dunbar's cabin. It was Dunbar who'd called the meeting 6 families a gathering to discuss how the collective was managing winter. What was needed, what could be shared. Practical and well-intentioned. Willa had agreed to come and Brock had sat in the row of chairs behind her, close enough to be present, far enough back to make clear that his wife was the one who spoke for them. She had told him to sit there. He had done it without argument, which was one of the reasons she had married him. The gathering was in Dunbar's main room, which was larger than most he'd built well and spaciously in the summer, when he'd had the time and the timber. 12 people around the main table, more standing against the walls. Earl at the head, Margaret beside him, the Cooper patriarch, the Yates family, the Hollanders and several others Willa knew by face, if not fully by name, and Calvin Steer at the far end of the table saying nothing. The meeting went as these things went. Earl reported on the collective state of the valley's fuel supply, not good in the aggregate. Several families were running shorter than expected. The early warm stretch in November had lulled people into under-preparation. Now, January was 3 days away and the real cold hadn't yet arrived, which everyone knew meant it was coming. When the conversation turned to the Hartwell supply system and whether more families could access it, Willa had begun to describe the exchange terms, the same terms she'd already explained a dozen times, labor and wet wood, in exchange for access and dry wood out. When Calvin Steer spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward or gesture. He simply spoke from where he sat at the end of the table, and his voice was the kind that filled a room without effort, the voice of someone who had always been listened to when he chose to speak. "The question," he said, "isn't whether Mrs. Hartwell's terms are fair. I'm sure they're perfectly fair." He paused. "The question is, who decided she got to set terms at all?" The room went quiet. Steer continued. "She built something the whole valley needs. Good. Smart. I'll give her that." He looked directly at Willa. "But she decides who gets warm and who doesn't. She decides how much and when and on what conditions. That's not neighborliness. That's not charity." He let the pause land. "That's power. And nobody in this room voted to give it to her." Willa heard Brock shift in the chair behind her. She reached back without turning and placed her hand on his arm. She did not look away from Steer. The room was waiting. She could feel it. The particular attention of a group that has just heard something provocative and is calibrating whether they agree or disagree, waiting to see how the subject of the provocation responds before they decide. She took her time. Not because she didn't have an answer, but because she understood that how she answered mattered as much as what she answered. And she wanted to get both right. "Mr. Steer," she said, "you arrived in August with 2 wagons, 4 hired men, and a surveyor's report you'd commissioned before you ever set foot in this valley." She kept her voice level and conversational. "You chose the best claim with the best water access and the most timber rights. You stacked enough wood to heat your house twice over." She paused. "Nobody voted on that either." A sound from the room. Not laughter exactly, something more careful. Acknowledgement. "The difference between your position and mine," she continued, "is that mine is available to anyone willing to learn it and work for it. What I built isn't locked against the valley. It's open to it. On terms." She looked around the table. "The terms exist because without them, there's nothing left to share. That's not power. That's arithmetic." Steer looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read. He wasn't angry, she realized. He was evaluating, still evaluating after all this time, the same way he'd been watching from the edge of her yard. He said, "Arithmetic can be wrong." "Mine hasn't been yet," she said. The meeting moved on. Earl Dunbar guided it back to practical questions, and several families made commitments to bring wet wood to the Hartwell system in exchange for access. 3 new families joined the exchange network. Steer left without speaking again. Walking home in the dark, Brock beside her, she said, "He's going to do something." What kind of something? She thought about the way he'd looked at her at the end. Not the look of a man who'd been defeated. The look of a man who was revising his approach. "I don't know yet," she said. New Year's Day arrived at 8 degrees below zero. Willa woke to the thermometer reading that Finn had brought in from outside and set on the table without comment, because no comment was needed. 8 below. The wind had come up overnight and was running hard from the northwest, and the sound of it against the cabin walls had changed pitch. From what it had been in December, deeper, more sustained, the sound of cold with real intention behind it. She had the fire up and the cabin at 50 degrees before anyone else was fully awake. She went down to the underground room and checked the levels. The system was running well temperature steady air, moving the back sections that had been going in for 10 days, showing the dry pale color at the split face that meant they were getting close. She came back up and started the breakfast. Cora woke with a sound that stopped Willa's hands. Not the small, shallow cough of the past 10 days. This was different. Wet and deep, reaching down into the chest for it. And when Willa went up the loft ladder and found her youngest daughter, Cora, was sitting up in her blankets, with her face flushed and her eyes too bright, the horse clutched against her chest. Willa put her hand on Cora's forehead, hot, not the gentle warmth of a child who's been sleeping under heavy blankets. A fever's heat, dry and aggressive, the body running its furnace hard against something it was fighting. Willa picked her up and brought her down from the loft, holding her close, feeling the heat of her press through both their clothes. She sat in the chair nearest the stove and held Cora, and rocked her slowly. And Cora put her head down against her mother's shoulder, and breathed in a way that Willa catalogued with the careful attention of a woman who had catalogued her children's breathing for years. Labored. Not dangerously, but working for it. Brock came out of the sleeping area and saw Willa's face and sat down at the table without speaking. The others came down one by one. Clem, Uida, Finn, who saw his mother's face and went immediately to put more wood on the fire without being asked. Bet, who came down last, looked at Cora for one long moment and then went to the window to check the vent stack's temperature plume. Strong, she said quietly. System's running well. Willa nodded without looking up from Cora. She spent the morning managing both things at once, the cabin and the child. The temperature in the room and the temperature in her daughter's body, the fuel supply and the fever. She made broth from the last of the salt pork and the dried herbs she'd been rationing since October. She kept Cora's blankets warm, but not hot. She checked the fever every hour. It was mid-afternoon when Finn went down for the scheduled supply pull and came back up the ladder with his face the color of the limestone at the bottom of the pit. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Willa. She had learned to read this face. She set Cora carefully into Brock's arms and went to the hatch. She went down alone. She stood in the underground room with the lamp raised, and she looked at what the night had taken. The iron bolt Brock had forged had been worked off its mounting entirely, not picked or forced removed. Someone with the right tool had unscrewed the fastening screws directly carefully and set the bolt aside. The hatch had been opened and closed with enough care that it hadn't made a sound anyone in the cabin could hear. And the front two sections of the room, everything she had been building toward the driest wood, the wood ready to burn 10 days' worth at their current burn rate. 12 days at strict rationing were gone. She stood very still in the cold earth room and did the arithmetic. She counted what remained. Back sections, green and damp, still weeks from ready. The middle sections approaching dryness, but not there yet. A small reserve she'd placed in a separate side stack, specifically against this kind of emergency, behind a false front of unsplit rounds that the thieves had not found. She counted the days between now and the point at which Cora's fever needed to break and Cora needed to be warm. She counted what those two numbers meant when you placed them against each other. For the first time since she had stepped down off the wagon onto Juniper Flats a month ago, the arithmetic came out wrong. She stood in the earth room for a long time. The lamp flame was still. The air moved its steady, silent circulation, warm from below, cool at the top, the system working its faithful geometry around a woman who was standing in the middle of it, with the arithmetic coming out wrong for the first time. She did not allow herself more than 2 minutes for this. She straightened the lamp. She walked to the emergency reserve and counted it exactly. She revised the arithmetic with what she found there, and it came out still not right, not properly, but less wrong than it had been 20 seconds ago, enough to create a narrow path through January. If the fever broke quickly and the cold didn't worsen, and no more wood was taken. Too many conditions. She knew it. She climbed the ladder. Brock was still holding Cora. The children were at the table. The fire was burning the juniper that Finn had brought from the outside stack before discovering the theft. And it burned clean and fast, the way juniper always did, generous and brief. Willa sat down at the table. She put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them. "Tell me," Clem said. She told them. All of it. The numbers, the remaining reserves, the conditions that would need to hold. She laid it out the way she always laid things out, clearly, without softening, because her family had earned the truth. And the truth was what they needed to make good decisions. When she finished, the cabin was quiet, except for the fire, and Cora's breathing from Brock's arms. Ida said, "It was steer." Nobody argued this time. Brock said, "I'll go to his place." Willa looked up. "And say what?" The question sat in the air. Brock didn't answer it because there was no good answer. You could not accuse a man of theft in a frontier valley without proof that would hold in front of the other families, and you could not prove what had happened underground in the dark of New Year's Eve with no witness and a lock removed with the right tool rather than forced by the wrong one. "We have no proof," she said. "And if we go to him with accusation and no proof, we lose the standing we have with the other families. Everything we've built out here, the network, the exchange, the trust depends on us being the ones who act right, even when the situation doesn't." "Cora has a fever," Brock said. His voice was even, but his eyes were not. "I know what Cora has," Willa said. She said it quietly. She did not raise her voice or change her expression, but something in the room shifted, something in the temperature of it that had nothing to do with the stove, and Brock looked at his wife's face and nodded once and sat back. Clem said, "Then what do we do?" Willa looked at the fire, looked at the way it consumed the juniper, fast and bright and brief. She looked at Cora's face against her father's chest, flushed, still. The small horse still in her hand. She put her hands back flat on the table and closed her eyes for just a moment. Outside, the New Year wind ran hard off the mountains and hit the cabin walls. And the cabin walls held because they had built them to hold, because she had laid them out herself, and Ida had chinked every gap. and they had done it right in the 13 days they'd been given. And it held. Inside, the fire burned. In the loft overhead, empty now, the place where her children slept, she thought about what it would mean to fail them. She let herself think about it fully, completely, without turning away from it. The complete thought, the worst version of what could happen if the arithmetic didn't improve. She held it for one moment. Then she let it go. She opened her eyes. "Nothing," she said. "Tonight we do nothing. We keep Cora warm. We bank the fire. We let the middle sections keep drying." She looked at her family. "And I am going to think." She stood up from the table. "I'll have an answer in the morning." Outside, the temperature was dropping again. The thermometer would read 14 below before dawn. The wind was running hard and cold off the mountains and across the flat valley floor and against every cabin wall in Juniper Flats, finding every gap, every weakness, every place where the work had not been done well enough. Willa Hartwell kept the fire burning and sat with her youngest daughter and thought through the night, while the new year began in the dark around her, cold and hard, and requiring something better than what she'd already built. She would find it. She always found it. But she had not found it yet. The cabin was quiet at 4 in the morning. Brock had finally fallen asleep in the chair an hour ago, still holding Cora. His chin dropped to his chest, his breathing slow and heavy with exhaustion. Willa had taken Cora from his arms without waking him, settled her daughter into the blanket nest she'd built near the stove, and tucked the small wooden horse back into the child's hand where it belonged. Cora's fever had not broken, but it had not risen further either. Willa checked it every hour with her palm against the small forehead, reading the temperature the way Betty read the vent stack. Not with numbers, but with knowledge, the accumulated knowledge of years of hands on this particular child's skin in health and in sickness. The fever was holding steady, doing its work. The body fighting and not yet losing. Willa sat at the table. She did not light a second lamp. She sat in the dim orange light of the banked stove, and she looked at the piece of paper she had placed on the table 3 hours ago, and she thought. She had spent the first hour thinking about the problem. She knew the wood supply, the arithmetic, the margin that had been stolen, and what it would take to rebuild it. She had gone through every angle she could find and come to the same wall each time. The wall was this, the supply she could produce. Even working the system at maximum capacity could not keep pace with the demand that had developed around it. She was one family with one underground room and one drying system, and a finite number of hours in each day. The valley's need had outgrown what she could provide before she'd even had time to understand the shape of it. She had spent the second hour thinking about this wall, not trying to go over it or around it, just looking at it the way she looked at difficult ground before she walked it honestly, without pretending it was something other than what it was. And somewhere in the second hour, something had shifted. She had been thinking about the wrong problem. She had been thinking about how to supply more wood, how to produce faster dry, faster distribute more efficiently, how to protect what she had and extend it further. She had been thinking, in other words, about being a better supplier, But that was not actually the problem. The problem was that Juniper Flats had 30-odd families who needed dry wood to survive a Colorado winter. And one family, hers, was the only one who knew how to make it. That was the problem, not the supply, the knowledge. She picked up the charcoal and the paper. She did not calculate wood this time. She calculated people. How many families? How many able-bodied adults per family? How many hours of daylight remaining in January? How many days until the ground would begin to soften in March and the worst of the cold would ease? How many underground rooms could be dug and built and operational in that window? If the right number of people with the right knowledge worked in organized rotation. The number she arrived at was not comfortable. It required things she wasn't certain she could get commitment from people who had already shown themselves willing to steal cooperation, from people who had reason to resent her trust, from people who didn't know her well enough yet to give it freely. But the number worked. She sat back and looked at it for a long time. Then she wrote at the top of the page in the careful print she'd learned from her schoolteacher mother in a one-room Ohio schoolhouse 30 years ago. What I know, what they need, how to trade one for the other. She wrote for another hour. When Brock woke at 5:30, stiff from the chair and disoriented for a moment before he found his bearings, he found Willa at the table with the paper in front of her, and both hands flat and still, the way she went still when she had finished a problem. He looked at her face first, then at the paper. "Show me," he said. She showed him. He read it slowly, the way he read everything, working through each piece before moving to the next, checking the connections. She watched his face move through the stages she knew. The initial skepticism, which was honest and healthy. The moment where the logic began to hold. The gradual opening of the expression as the whole picture assembled itself. When he finished, he looked up. "You stop distributing entirely," he said. "Starting today. Starting today. People will be angry, yes. Some of them are already angry enough to steal from us." "I know." She took the paper back. "Which is exactly why I stopped giving them something to steal." Brock was quiet for a moment. "And Cora." Willa looked at her daughter in the blanket nest, still sleeping, the horse still in her hand. "The reserve I held back is enough for 6 days if we're careful. The fever will break before that." She said it with the particular quality of certainty that was not certainty at all, but was the decision to behave as though something were certain because certainty of action was sometimes the only kind available. Brock looked at Cora, then at his wife. "Tell me what you need me to do," he said. She told him. He listened. He asked 2 questions and she answered both. Then he stood up and went to put more wood on the fire. And the cabin began to warm for the day, and outside the January dark pressed hard against every wall. She sent Clem to the Dunbar place before breakfast with a message for Earl. A meeting 2 days from now. Everyone in the valley who could come. Dunbar's cabin if he was willing to host it. She would explain everything at the meeting. Earl sent back a reply within the hour via Clem's return. Yes, he'd host it. He asked no questions. Willa noted this and added it to the column in her mind where she kept the things she could rely on. The 2 days between the decision and the meeting were the most demanding of the whole winter, and they were demanding in a different way than the building had been. The building had demanded her body. This demanded everything else. She went to every family in the exchange network personally. Not Brock, not Clem. Her. She walked to each cabin in the January cold, and January cold in the Colorado High Valley was a different animal than December cold. It had weight and permanence to it. It had given up pretending to be temporary, and she knocked on each door and she explained face to face that the wood distributions were ending. She did not apologize. She did not qualify. She said it directly, and then she said, "Come to the meeting at Dunbar's on Thursday and hear what comes next." Most people listened. A few were immediately hostile, the Hollanders who had never fully engaged with the exchange terms and had been treating the system more as a supply depot than a knowledge transfer. A man named Galt from the south end of the valley who had never come to learn anything but had sent his teenage sons twice to collect wood. With these, she was patient and clear and did not debate. Come to the meeting. On the second day, the afternoon before the meeting, she was returning from the Yates cabin when she saw a figure at the far end of the lane leading to her property, standing still, watching steer. She walked toward him at her normal pace, and he didn't move until she was 20 feet away, and then he turned and walked back toward his own property without speaking. She watched him go. She thought about Ida's words. It would have been me. She thought about the bolt removed with careful tool work in the dark of New Year's Eve, the precision of it, the calculation of it, the specific cold anger that would be required to take wood from a family with a sick child, not from desperation, but from the intent to destabilize. She thought about what Steer had said at the Dunbar meeting. Nobody voted to give it to her, and she thought about something else. Something she had been turning over since she'd first heard him say it. He had not been entirely wrong. She had built something the valley needed, and she had controlled it. And her terms had been reasonable, but they had been her terms and no one had chosen them. He had named a real thing even in service of a bad purpose. And real things named correctly had to be addressed, not dismissed. She would address it at the meeting. Thursday came cold and clear, 15 below at dawn. The kind of cold that announces itself before you open the door by the sound it makes at the window glass and the draft it sends under the door, no matter how well chinked the threshold. Willa left Brock at the cabin with Cora. She did not ask him if he wanted to come. She told him she needed him there with Cora. And she needed him there in a way that meant she was not being polite. She needed someone she trusted completely, to be with her sick child while she was gone. And there was only one person she trusted completely. He understood. He put his hand on her arm as she was pulling on her coat, just for a moment. Then he let her go. She walked to the Dunbar cabin with Clem and Ida, one on each side, the three of them moving through the cold in silence. Ida was 12 years old and walked like someone 10 years older, her chin level, her breath steaming in even intervals. Clem moved with the elongated ease of a young man who had spent the last month building his body into something that could do what was required of it. Willa walked between them and thought about nothing except what she was about to say and in what order. The Dunbar cabin held 40 people. 40 people was too many for the space, and the space knew it. The warmth that Earl's well-stocked stove produced was immediately consumed by 40 bodies in the door opening and closing as people arrived, and the room sat at a temperature that was merely not freezing, which was as warm as it was gonna get. People stood along the walls and crowded the area near the door and sat on every horizontal surface Earl and Margaret possessed. Willa recognized most of them, the families who'd been part of the exchange network, the ones who'd come to her directly. Several faces she hadn't seen before, people from the outer edges of Juniper Flats, and one or two from Redwater Gulch who had heard through the particular telegraph of frontier necessity that something was happening here worth hearing about. Calvin Steer was there. He stood against the far wall with his arms at his sides and his face giving nothing away. Earl Dunbar opened the meeting with the brevity of a man who understood that warmth and time were both limited. "Mrs. Hartwell called this meeting and she'll run it," he said. "I'll ask everyone to give her a fair hearing." Willa stepped to the front of the room. She had decided in the days of thinking and the hours of walking cold roads and the long nights sitting with Cora exactly how to begin. Not with explanation, not with defense, with the one thing that cut through everything else. "As of today," she said, "the Hartwell wood distributions are finished." The room erupted. She had expected this. She stood in it the way you stood in weather present, and still letting it move through without moving you. She heard the specific voices within the general noise and filed them gaunt, loud, and immediately hostile. The Hollander's son, younger and more impulsive than his father. 2 or 3 voices she didn't recognize, probably the Redwater families, confused and angry. The majority was not shouting, the majority was processing, murmuring. Turning to neighbors with questions, she waited. It took about 45 seconds for the noise to drop to a level where speech was possible. She had timed this kind of room before. Not this room, but this kind of room, and 45 seconds was about right. "I said the distributions are finished," she said again, and the room went quiet enough. "Because I'm offering something better." Calvin Steer moved just slightly against the far wall. She didn't look at him directly. "Here is what I know," she said. "I know how to build an underground drying room that will turn wet wood into fuel in 7 to 12 days. I know how to run a heat channel from a cabin stove to that room. I know how to organize the storage and the rotation and the ventilation. I built one in the middle of December, in frozen ground with my family, and it worked." She looked around the room. "And I will teach every single person in this room how to do the same thing. For free. No terms. No exchange requirements. Everything I know given to anyone willing to receive it." The room had gone fully quiet now. "But," she continued, "I cannot heat the valley by myself. That's not stubbornness, and it's not self-protection. It's arithmetic. 1 room, 1 family, 1 winter's worth of wood. I was always gonna run out of room for everyone's needs. What I built was a proof, a demonstration that this works." She paused. "Now you build your own." A man near the door, Cooper, she thought, said, "The ground's frozen solid." "It was frozen when I built mine," she said. "In December. We broke through it with pickaxes and determination." She let this sit for a moment. "It's harder now. I won't pretend otherwise. But it's not impossible, and the difference between harder and impossible is the difference between a family that's warm in February and one that isn't." Galt from his place near the wall said, "You had your husband and your son. Some of us are working with less, which is why I'm proposing crews," she said. 3 families working together, rotating between 3 builds. Each family works all 3 sites. You share the labor, and you share the knowledge, and by the time all 3 rooms are built, every adult in that crew knows the whole system well enough to maintain it and teach it to someone else. She heard the shift in the room. The quality of the attention changed, still wary, still not fully trusting, but engaged now in the actual possibility of the thing, rather than the emotional response to the announcement. Steer spoke from the far wall. "And who oversees the quality?" he said. "Who decides whether a room is built right before someone stakes their family's survival on it?" He was still doing what he always did, finding the real question inside the provocation. She had prepared for this one. "My family," she said. "Specifically, I'll do it." It was Ida, 12 years old, standing to Willa's left, arms crossed, chin level, speaking with the flat certainty of someone who had inspected every log and every gap and every split piece of wood in the Hartwell cabin and found the substandard ones and demanded they be redone. The room looked at her. "I've checked every piece of the Hartwell system," Ida said in the tone she used when stating obvious facts. "I know what right looks like, and I know what wrong looks like. If you want your room certified, bring me to look at it before you fill it." There was a pause that could have gone either way. Then Earl Dunbar made a sound not quite a laugh, something more respectful than that, and said, "Well." Willa did not smile, but something in her chest did. Before she could speak again, Clem said from her right side, "I'll teach the heat channel system to any crew that's ready." He said it simply, without performance. 16 years old, steady as a post, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had built the thing with his own hands and understood it completely. "I'll run the organization and the rotation systems," Finn said. He was standing near the back, almost hidden behind the adults, but his voice was clear. 9 years old, certain. "The ventilation," Bet said. She was beside Finn, and she held up her hand the way she did when she was demonstrating the vent stack check. "I'll teach that part." Willa looked at her family. Her 16-year-old, her 12-year-old, her 9-year-old, her 7-year-old, standing in the front of a room full of adults who were cold and scared and needed help, each one offering what they actually had, what they had earned in the hardest month of their lives. She turned back to the room. "My children will teach what they know," she said. "I will oversee the builds and answer questions your crew leaders can't answer. My husband will teach the excavation and timbering he has mine experience, and he built ours from first principles in frozen ground. This is what we're offering." She looked around the room one more time. "Who's in?" Earl Dunbar stood up. "Dunbars are in," he said. "Johnson family, Cooper family, you with me?" Both heads nodded before Dunbar finished the sentence. "First crew," Willa said. "Anyone else?" 3 more hands went up almost simultaneously. Within 15 minutes, 7 crews had formed, 22 families committed, start dates, assigned plans, sketched out on the back of the same flour sack paper Willa had been using since December. Steer had not moved from his place against the wall. Willa caught his eye once at the end as people were filing out into the cold. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he turned and walked out without speaking. She did not know what that meant yet. She would find out. The first cruise broke ground on January 8th. Willa was at the Dunbar site at first light, Brock beside her for the excavation phase, and she watched him take a man Earl's age through the technique for breaking frozen crust. The angle of the pickaxe, the rhythm of the swing that preserved your shoulders the way to read the ground strata, so you knew when you'd hit workable earth and could switch to the shovel. Earl Dunbar was not a small man, and he was not soft, and he learned fast the way capable people learned fast when they recognized something worth knowing. By noon, the Dunbar pit was 4 feet deep at the corners and 3 in the center. By the end of the second day, it was at depth, and Brock had moved on to the timbering instruction while Willa walked to the Cooper site, where the second crew was 2 days behind. She moved between sites each day. Hartwell's in the morning, Dunbar's at midday, Cooper's in the afternoon, checking in on the Yates crew at the end of the day before walking home in the dark. She ate quickly and checked Cora and looked at the numbers and went to sleep and did it again. Clem taught the heat channel to whoever was ready for it. He had a gift for explanation that Willa recognized as distinct from her own. Where she explained through logic and sequence, he explained through demonstration and analogy. And she watched him with a group of adults twice his age one afternoon, and saw them understand something in the way you see a lamp lit in a window, and she filed this quality in the column of things she would remember about her son for the rest of her life. Ida inspected. She came to each build at the stage where the timber walls were in and the facing boards were going up, and she ran her hands along every surface and checked every joint and called out every gap and deviation from standard without hesitation or apology. Grown men adjusted their work to the specifications of a 12-year-old girl, and they did it because her specifications were right, and the evidence of the Hartwell room, the wood it had produced the winter it had helped survive, was standing proof that right mattered. She was not popular. She didn't appear to notice. Finn built his organizational system into every new room from the ground up. He had distilled it to a set of principles simple enough to teach in 20 minutes, but robust enough to run all winter without adjustment. He made small charred wood markers for each crew to use and showed them how to establish the rotation system and how to read the stacks by age without needing to remember every individual piece. Bet visited every completed room on its first day of operation and placed her palm over the vent stack and told the family whether it was working correctly. She was by the second week the most sought-after member of the Hartwell family on the build circuit, because what she offered was immediate and unambiguous working or not working right now today. And frontier people in January had a deep appreciation for the unambiguous. On the 12th of January, Cora's fever broke. Willa was at the Cooper site when it happened. Brock sent Clem to find her, and Clem appeared at the edge of the work area and said only, "Cora." And Willa was already moving. She walked the mile home at a pace just below running, which was the pace she allowed herself because running in the cold used warmth she couldn't afford to spend. She came in through the cabin door, and Brock was at the table with Cora in his lap, and Cora looked up at her mother with eyes that were clear for the first time in 12 days. The brightness was gone from her cheeks. The fever brightness, the wrong brightness. What was there instead was the ordinary pink of a small child who had been warm and was feeling better and wanted something to eat. "Hungry," Cora said, holding the horse. Willa sat down across from her daughter, and she looked at her face for a long moment. She looked at it completely, and without the careful management of feeling that she'd been maintaining since New Year's morning when she'd put her hand to this forehead and found the fever. She let herself feel the full thing. It lasted for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she stood up and went to the stove to make the porridge, and she made it with the good oats she'd been rationing since November. And she added a small spoonful of the maple sugar she'd been saving since Ohio, and she set it in front of Cora and watched her daughter eat. That night, for the first time in 2 weeks, she slept through until morning. The build program ran through the rest of January and into the first 2 weeks of February. 7 crews rotating through 22 family sites. The Hartwells taught and supervised and checked and revised, and the Valley of Juniper Flats was changed by the doing of it in ways that went beyond wood and fire. The people who came to build together stayed to talk. They solved problems collectively that they'd been solving individually or not solving at all. The Cooper family, it turned out, had a surplus of the specific clay needed for chimney mortar and had been sitting on it. The Hollanders needed exactly that clay and had been using an inferior substitute. The trade happened on a Tuesday afternoon between 2 women who'd barely spoken before, arranged by Finn while he was explaining the rotation system. Earl Dunbar, after his own room was complete, began appearing at other build sites, offering his labor for the excavation phase, which he had by now become genuinely good at. He moved through the valley in January, the way the cold moved, steady and thorough and present everywhere, and his involvement legitimized the program for families who might otherwise have held back. The Hartwells had not created a charity. They had created a system, and systems had a way of generating their own momentum once the first pieces were in motion. Willa managed all of it. She managed it the way she managed the underground room, with the precise attention of someone who understood that the margin between success and failure was not comfortable and could not be treated as though it were. She watched for the builds that were cutting corners. She watched for the families who were participating nominally but not absorbing the knowledge, going through the motions of learning without actually learning. She redirected and reinforced, and occasionally, through Ida, required work to be redone. She was not always liked. She understood this and accepted it. She was trusted. That was the thing that mattered, and trust was different from liking and more durable. On January 22nd, Mrs. Steer came to the Hartwell cabin at 10:30 at night. Willa heard the knock and was at the door before the second one. She'd been awake. She was usually awake at this hour, making the late-night check on the underground room and reviewing the next day's schedule. The cold that came in around the doorframe when she opened it told her how far below zero the night had gone. Mrs. Steer stood on the step. She was perhaps 45, a thin woman with capable hands and a face that had weathered well. And she was holding her youngest child, a boy perhaps 18 months, wrapped in every piece of cloth she'd been able to find. The child's face was against her shoulder. His breathing was audible from the doorstep. She didn't say anything immediately. She just looked at Willa with the specific expression of a woman who has crossed a threshold she wasn't sure she could cross, and is now standing on the other side of it, not certain what happens next. Willa stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. Mrs. Steer came in. Brock was awake and at the table, and he looked at the woman and the child, and he moved to put more wood on the fire without being asked. The child's name was Henry. He had the same fever Cora had carried. Wet cough, two bright eyes, the body working hard against something it was fighting. Mrs. Steer said he'd been sick for 4 days, and the wood in the Steer cabin had been burning poorly. And she hadn't known, she said she hadn't entirely known until the last 2 days, how much worse it was than she'd understood. She stopped speaking and looked at the fire, and said nothing else about her husband. Willa asked Bet, who had woken at the sound of the door and come silently down the loft ladder to check the underground room and bring up the supply for tomorrow, plus what she estimated this child needed. Bet went down. She came back up with the wood measured and stacked as she always did, no more and no less than what was needed. She set it beside the stove. Willa brewed the salt pork broth, the same she'd made for Cora. She showed Mrs. Steer how she'd managed the fever, the temperature management, the specific herbs she'd found useful, and she wrote it down on a piece of paper and gave it to her. She told Mrs. Steer where the nearest active build crew was working out on the Yates property, and that they would be there from first light on the 23rd. Mrs. Steer looked at the paper in her hands for a moment. Then she looked at Willa. She said, "He was wrong to do what he did." Willa said, "Your boy needs to be warm. That's what matters tonight." Mrs. Steer left before midnight, carrying the wood and the broth recipe and the address of the Yates crew, and her sick child held close against the cold. Willa stood at the closed door for a moment after she left. Brock came to stand beside her. "You didn't say anything about the theft," he said. "No." "Why?" She thought about it. She had thought about this moment, had known some version of it was probably coming since the night of the second theft, had run through the various ways she might handle it, had considered and discarded several. The version she'd arrived at was this one. Because she already knew, she said, and she came anyway. That took something from her. She turned from the door. "I don't need her to hear it from me." Calvin Steer appeared at the Yates build site on the morning of January 23rd. Earl Dunbar saw him first. He came to find Willa, who was on the far side of the site helping position a cross brace, and said quietly, "Steer's here." Willa straightened. She looked across the work site to where Steer stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down into the pit. He was holding a pickaxe. He had not brought it from somewhere else. She recognized it as the spare that the Yates family kept by their shed and that the crews had been using during the timbering phase. He had picked it up and brought it to the dig. She watched him for a moment. He was looking at the pit, the way she'd watched Brock look at the Pennsylvania mine, with a recognition that was also a decision, the look of someone who has been somewhere and is returning to it from a direction they didn't anticipate. Dunbar said quietly, "You want me to?" "No," she said. She went back to the crossbrace. Behind her, she heard the sound of a pickaxe entering frozen earth. One stroke, then another, finding the rhythm. The particular rhythm of someone who had done this kind of work before, and whose body remembered it before his mind fully caught up. She didn't look back. Ida appeared at her elbow 20 minutes later. The girl looked at her mother with the expression she used when she was reporting a fact that contained more information than the fact itself. "He's good," Ida said, "at the excavation. He's fast, and he's not wasting motion." "I know," Willa said. "He's going to be useful." "I know that too." Ida stood there for another moment. "Do you want me to go check his work?" Willa looked at her daughter. 12 years old, unsparing and precise, and not inclined towards sentiment. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly your job. Go do it." Ida went. Steer did not apologize. He did not make a speech or an explanation or a justification. He showed up every morning from January 23rd onward, at whatever site was active, and he worked. He was methodical and precise and technically skilled in the excavation and timbering phases in ways that suggested he had building experience he had not previously offered. And he applied these skills with the full focus of a man who has decided to be useful and is not interested in doing it halfway. He also, within a week, began to function as a site supervisor for the excavation phase. He had the authority of someone who knows the work and doesn't need to claim it. And the other men took his direction naturally, before anyone had formally assigned him that role. Willa watched this happen and let it happen. Bet told her one afternoon checking the Steer family's newly completed vent stack. Yes, they had built one quietly in the first week of February without announcement that it was working well. Strong flow-right temperature properly capped. He built it exactly right, Bet said. Better than some of the others. He had a good teacher, Willa said. Bet looked at her. He taught himself. He learned from watching, Willa said. That's not the same as teaching yourself. She looked at the vent stack. Someone made something worth watching. The 23rd underground room was completed on February 14th. It belonged to a family named Pruitt Late Arrivals from Kansas, who had come to Juniper Flats in November with hope and insufficient preparation, who had spent most of December and January managing with inadequate fuel through a combination of luck, careful rationing, and the generosity of the exchange network. They had joined the build program in the second week and worked every site since. The Pruitt room was the smallest 10x7 one adult could almost touch both walls with outstretched arms. but it was built correctly, timbered right, vented right, floor slatted right. Ida had certified it the previous afternoon without finding anything to require correction. Willa had attended the completion of the Pruitt room on the 23rd build. She didn't attend every completion, but she had attended the first and the last, and she stood at the open hatch on a February afternoon and looked down into the room that was already beginning to hold its temperature, and she felt the steady cool of it rising up past her. 23 rooms in Juniper Flats. 23 families with a system and the knowledge of how to run it. And just as importantly, the knowledge of how to build it again if something failed and it needed rebuilding. 23 families who had stood in the cold and broken frozen ground together, and who knew now something specific and indelible about what the people beside them were made of. She closed the Pruitt hatch. Clem was beside her, and Ida and Finn and Bet and the Pruitt family standing around the hatch, with the expressions of people who have built something they didn't think they could build, and are still slightly surprised by themselves. Mrs. Pruitt said, "Thank you." Willa said, "You built it. Thank yourself." March came in with the smell of mud, not the gray iron mud of December that had been the smell of hard ground reluctantly yielding. This was something alive in it, something that had been compressed under cold for months and was now expanding again, returning to itself, and the smell of it was the specific smell of the earth's patience being rewarded. Willa stood outside the cabin in the early morning of the 1st of March. Her coat open because open was possible now, and she listened to the creek. It had been running under ice all winter, audible in quiet moments, and now it was audible in most moments. And the sound of it had changed from the muffled, tentative sound of something constrained to the full sound of water doing what water was made to do. The valley floor showed the first thin green at the creek margin. Not much. Enough. Brock came out and stood beside her. They stood together in the early light and looked at Juniper Flats. Smoke rose from every chimney, some thin, some thick. But every cabin had fire, and every fire had fuel, and the fires that burned now burned clean. She could read it in the color of the smoke, the way it rose steady and gray rather than the dark, struggling plume of wet wood smoldering against itself. Across the valley, 23 underground rooms were running their faithful geometry of air and heat and time, doing the patient work of turning what the land gave into what people needed. "Cora walked to the creek yesterday," Brock said. "I know. I watched her from the window. She's fully recovered. I know that too." He put his hand on her arm. "You saved them," he said. "All of them." She looked at the valley for a moment before she answered. She thought about the January nights and the 2 thefts and the arithmetic that had come out wrong and the 4 in the morning with the piece of paper when she had sat with the wrong problem and the right one had finally shown itself. She thought about 40 people in a cold room and her 12-year-old daughter saying, "I'll do it," with her arms crossed. She thought about Mrs. Steer on the doorstep at 10:30, with a sick baby and the pride it had cost her to be there, and what it had taken to open the door to that and answer it plainly. She thought about Calvin Steer with a pickaxe at the edge of a frozen pit, finding the rhythm his body remembered. She thought about Cora at the creek walking in the first March mud carrying her small wooden horse. "We taught them," she said. "They saved themselves." Brock was quiet for a moment. Then, "You taught them." "The children taught them," she said. "Clem and Ida and Finn and Bet. Each of them taught what they knew. I just organized it." She paused. "And the knowing came from you. The mine, the drying room, the heat channel. That was yours. You asked the right question," he said. "I just answered it." She looked at him. He looked back at her. After a moment, she said, "We should start the kitchen garden survey this week. Ground's workable at the south edge. And the seed order needs to go to Redwater before the end of the month." He smiled. "Already thinking about spring." "I've been thinking about spring since December," she said. She turned back to the cabin. Cora would be awake soon, and the morning fire needed tending, and the underground room still had its morning supply to manage. And the day was beginning with the particular quality of beginning that March days have when winter has finally let go, and everything that was waiting has permission to start. The hatch was where it had always been, flush with the south wall, the iron hardware cold and dark in the early light. It looked ordinary. It looked like one of 23. Because it was. Willa went inside. The fire was low and needed wood, and she knew exactly where to find it. And she went down to get it, as she did every morning, as she would continue to do until the spring made it unnecessary, the work of the season completed by the people who had chosen to do it together, in the hard ground, in the cold, with what December had given them.